It was nearly midnight on April 14th, 1912, when the RMS Titanic struck an iceberg, and 2 hours and 40 minutes later, vanished beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. 2,206 passengers and crew were on board at the time. Only 705 would survive. Almost immediately, the press began to publish varying and often contradictory reports of the disaster. In this tangle of contradictory information, a narrative began to form. A narrative that was neatly packaged and often retold. Filson Young published a book about the sinking just 37 days after the event. A Night to Remember, still considered the definitive resource on the Titanic disaster, was published in 1956 and made into a feature film 2 years later. The book's author, Walter Lord, would go on to act as a consultant on James Cameron's opus, 1997's Titanic, which has become most modern audiences' touchstone for the Titanic story. Cameron was extremely attentive to detail, and his representation of the ship is very accurate. But in the telling of the story, there are errors held over from the reporting at the time, from Walter Lord's version of events, and entirely fictional inventions included for the sake of storytelling. The result is that the modern Titanic story is as much myth as it is fact, and 3 men at various times and in various retellings have been cast as the villain in this mythical story. They are J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's designer, and the ship's captain, Edward J. Smith. But who is really at fault for the sinking of the RMS Titanic? In the early 1900s, the transatlantic passenger trade was highly profitable and competitive. 2 of the chief lines were White Star and Cunard. In 1907, 2 Cunard ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, entered service and were praised for their speed. Both would set speed records crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Looking to remain competitive, White Star chairman J. Bruce Ismay met with shipbuilding firm Harland & Wolff, who had a long-established relationship with the White Star Line, dating back to 1867. They devised a plan to build a class of large liners that would be known for their comfort instead of their speed. It was eventually decided that 3 Olympic-class vessels would be constructed: the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. In 1909, work began on both the Olympic and the Titanic. The 2 ships were built side by side. The Olympic's maiden voyage took place on June 14, 1911, almost a year before the Titanic would set sail. As the largest ship in the world and the first in a new class of superliners, the Olympic attracted considerable worldwide attention from the press and the public. Titanic's maiden voyage received a lot less press coverage until 4 days into the journey, when disaster struck. J. Bruce Ismay was cast as the villain almost immediately. American newspaper magnate William Hearst held some animosity towards Ismay, and when news broke that Ismay had survived and boarded one of the ship's lifeboats, Hearst's syndicated press ran a vitriolic campaign against him. Women and children first was an unofficial part of the maritime code of conduct at the time. It was a man's role to safeguard women and children, and if necessary, go down with the ship. The Denver Post wrote of the behavior of those men that had died. When the dear ones, the dependent ones, had been sent to safety in the lifeboats and had drifted away into the dark night, these true men, calm and courageous, stood alone upon the deck of the doomed ship and went down to death and to glory. Who would not choose so glorious a death? Ismay did not choose death, and the Hearst-controlled press took this as the ultimate act of cowardice, with one paper writing, "We respectfully suggest that the emblem of the White Star be changed to that of a yellow liver." He was cast as a coward who lied and bullied his way onto one of the few available lifeboats. However, 3 weeks after the Titanic sank, the British Wreck Commissioner, on behalf of the British Board of Trade, held an inquiry into the disaster, and it concluded that Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found C collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side, actually being lowered. No other people were there at the time. There was room for him, and he jumped in. Had he not jumped in, he would simply have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of the lost. Yes, Ismay did escape on a lifeboat, but only after he had helped with the loading and lowering of several others, and only when he was sure that no women and children were in the vicinity. But there is another, much more serious allegation, one that suggests Ismay was directly responsible for the disaster by interfering with the navigation of the Titanic. It was alleged that he insisted the ship run at unsafe speeds, even though he was aware that other ships had relayed ice warnings. It suggested he did this to ensure the Titanic would surpass the speed records set by his competitor ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. This accusation came to light not in the official British or the US Senate inquiry, but in a civil court case which began in June 1913. 14 years earlier, in 1899, Ismay sold the White Star Line to IMMC, the International Mercantile Marine Company, controlled by American industrialist J.P. Morgan. But Ismay maintained a managerial role at White Star. After the disaster, passengers and families of the deceased filed hundreds of claims, seeking more than $16 million in damages. IMMC argued that their liability should be capped. They argued that Ismay had forced Captain Smith to run the ship at a dangerous speed in an attempt to set a new crossing record. Their star witness was passenger Emily Ryerson. The evidence was, at best circumstantial, at worst, pure invention. When asked if Mr. Ismay said they were going to make a record, she replied, "No, I wouldn't say he said those words. His attitude or his language, we assumed that we were trying to make a record. I wouldn't say he used those words." The case was settled for $664,000. Additionally, a letter from Ismay to the directors of IMMC came to light, in which Ismay made it clear that he saw little value in attempting to reach the destination early, as arriving ahead of schedule could be a massive inconvenience for passengers. White Star's policy was to operate vessels of huge size and moderate speed, affording great comfort to their passengers. The letter was written in 1911 in response to an IMMC request that on her next voyage, the Olympic attempt to arrive on Tuesday, a day earlier than expected. Ismay wrote, "I feel very strongly that passengers would be far more satisfied to know when they left here that they would not land until Wednesday morning, rather than be in a state of uncertainty in regard to this for the whole of the trip." The British inquiry would conclude, "There is no evidence that Mr. Ismay interfered in any way with the navigation of the ship." This finding, combined with the letters to IMMC and the fact that the Titanic had chosen to sail the southern track, the longest route from Southampton to New York, suggests that achieving a speed record was never a priority for Ismay or the White Star Line. Following the loss of the Titanic, Ismay's request to remain as the director of White Star Line was rejected by the board of IMMC, severing, after 47 years, the Ismay family's connection with the White Star Line. In the years after the tragedy, Ismay donated a significant sum to the pension fund for widows of the disaster, and helped the families of victims with their multitude of insurance claims. Now let's turn to another man caught in the crosshairs of public opinion, the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews. He made a point of sailing with a team of mechanics on the maiden voyages of all White Star Line ships, in an effort to identify and correct any design issues. He was on board the Titanic for its fateful maiden voyage. The main accusation is that Thomas Andrews made design faults which could have been the deciding factor in the ship sinking after it was damaged. Additionally, he could have done more at the design stage to increase the lifeboat capacity, and was well aware that the 20 lifeboats included in his design would not be sufficient for the passenger capacity of the ship. But let's begin with the bulkheads. Bulkheads serve several purposes. They increase the structural strength of the vessel, but they also create watertight compartments that can contain water and limit flooding in the case of a hull breach. The issue with the bulkheads on the Titanic is that they didn't extend to the full height of the vessel. When First Officer Murdoch ordered hard a starboard and full speed ahead, the Titanic very slowly veered to port, but the Iceberg scraped along the right side of the hull below the waterline, slicing it open and flooding several compartments. The damage was such that the water rose to the height of these partial bulkheads and began spilling over into adjacent compartments. The bow of the ship begins to sink, the water spills over into more compartments, the ship loses buoyancy and sinks. Warships at the time, such as the HMS Dreadnought, were being built with full-height bulkheads, so they could withstand enemy fire and remain afloat even when damaged. Crew comfort and convenience was not a factor, and navigating these full bulkheads required many small doors and ladders. This is just not viable for a passenger ship. Paying passengers demand airy, well-lit cabins, large open public spaces, long corridors and big staircases, such as the Titanic's grand staircase, so they can easily travel around the ship and enjoy its amenities. So in the end, the Thomas Andrews bulkhead design was a compromise between survivability and the ship's function as a luxury passenger liner. And what's more, Titanic actually exceeded the safety requirements set by the British Board of Trade, both in number of lifeboats carried and the height of the bulkheads. Obviously, after the disaster, those regulations would be changed. Unfortunately, the Titanic found herself in a collision which exceeded the worst-case scenario predicted by her builders. At least 5 compartments were breached, possibly 6. If one of Titanic's contemporaries had sustained similar damage, it too would have sank. More evidence that the design of the Titanic and the Olympic class of ships in general was sound can be found by looking at the career of Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic. Virtually identical to the Titanic, the Olympic had a career spanning 24 years, from 1911 to 1935, including service as a troop ship during the First World War, which gained her the nickname Old Reliable. So it would be unfair and inaccurate to lay blame at the feet of Thomas Andrews. After Titanic struck the iceberg, Thomas Andrews inspected the damage and estimated that the ship had 90 minutes to 2 hours before it sank. He relayed this to Captain Smith, who sent out a distress call. Andrews then urged passengers to get onto the lifeboats. Some witnesses claimed that at the end, Andrews was on the deck throwing deck chairs to those in the water. He went down with the ship, and his body was never recovered. Now let's briefly turn our attention to the ship's captain, Edward John Smith. As the captain of the Titanic, many people point to Smith as being responsible for the 1912 disaster. After all, it is the captain's duty to navigate the correct course, to set the designated speed, appoint the correct number of lookouts, respond to warnings, and ensure the safety of all passengers and crew members. The main accusation against Smith is the fact that despite receiving multiple warnings about ice, he continued to sail at a relatively high speed, about 22 knots. It is true that Smith was aware of multiple ice warnings, but he acknowledged the warnings and changed course. He turned further south in hopes of completely avoiding the ice. The standard nautical protocol at the time was to maintain full speed ahead until immediate danger presented itself. According to 5th Officer Harold Lowe's testimony at the US Senate inquiry, the custom was to go ahead and depend on the lookouts in the crow's nest and the watch on the bridge to pick up the ice in time to avoid hitting it. Captain Smith's actions are completely in line with the procedures of the day. Some criticized the delay between the collision with the iceberg and the distress call going out. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, Smith waited for the results of the inspection. He made sure the wireless operator was ready to send out a distress call if needed. Once the inspection came back with the bad news, Smith gave orders to prepare the lifeboats and muster the passengers on deck with life jackets on. He worked out their position and told the wireless operators to send out the call for help. Smith went down with the ship, and his body was never recovered. So if Captain Smith isn't to blame, and neither J. Bruce Ismay or Thomas Andrews are responsible, then who is? The answer is that there is probably no one to blame. The sinking of the Titanic was a tragic accident, a rare and random event. The chances that the Titanic would encounter that iceberg and collide with it were exceedingly low. But it's human nature to ask why, to search for answers and look for reasons, in part so we can understand what happened and prevent it from happening again. But sometimes there are no answers. But there is one more person who could have averted tragedy. He couldn't have prevented the Titanic from hitting the iceberg, but perhaps he could have minimized the loss of life. It's the captain of the SS Californian, Captain Stanley Lord. Both the US Senate inquiry and the British Wreck Commission inquiry found that the Californian was nearer the Titanic than the 19 miles reported by her captain, and that her officers and crew saw the distress signals of the Titanic and failed to respond to them in accordance with the diktats of humanity, international usage, and the requirements of law. The SS Californian was stopped due to ice, and its wireless operator had turned off the radio and gone to bed. The crew of the Titanic believed they saw a ship in the distance and fired emergency flares. The crew of the Californian saw the flares and Stanley Lord was woken, twice, but said that the flares were probably company rockets, signals between ships from the same line simply acknowledging each other. So the flares were ignored. The British inquiry would conclude that the Californian was some 9 to 19 kilometers from the Titanic, and that she might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. Lord's career was severely impacted by the findings of both inquiries, but historians still differ on whether or not he was negligent in his duty. Some argue that even if the Californian had responded to the Titanic's emergency flares, she would have gotten there no sooner than the RMS Carpathia, who would eventually come to Titanic's rescue. The crew of the RMS Carpathia found 705 stunned, frightened, and shivering survivors left adrift in the Titanic's lifeboats. The ship itself was long gone. Passengers would ask, why had the largest, safest ship in the world, one hailed in the press as unsinkable, foundered in less than 3 hours, after a collision so slight most of the passengers and crew slept right through it? These are questions that continue to plague historians, even more than 100 years after the event.